Thank you for joining us today. My name is Irena Knezevic. I'm at Carleton University, and I have been working on food systems research for, well over a decade now. I'm heavily involved with the FLEdGE network, which is hosting this wonderful webinar series. FLEdGE is short for Food Locally Embedded, Globally Engaged, and we are a research and knowledge sharing partnership funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. We are committed to fostering food systems that are socially just, ecologically regenerative, economically localized, and engaging with citizens. This webinar is the first in our Good Food Solutions series. And if you're interested in receiving more information about our upcoming webinars and other events, we encourage you to follow us on Twitter at FLEdGE Research, and you can also sign up to our mailing list. Before we get started with the webinar, I want to just give a big shout out to the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems for hosting this, and big kudos to the amazing team there, Amanda De Battista and Heather Reed, who are handling the organizing and technical aspects of this webinar. If you have any questions as we go, please put them in the chat box, and I see people are already using that. We will be recording this webinar and posting it online. The webinar will wrap up at about 1 o'clock. We'll take a 5-minute break, and for those of you who are interested in staying on for an extra half an hour for a coffee chat, we will stay online. We'll just take a brief break, and then we'll regroup online to have a more open conversation. I'm very pleased today to introduce 4 amazing speakers who will introduce us to the policy issues that are top of mind for those of us who are working with food systems at this time. Our first presenter is going to be Joanna Wilkes. She's a PhD candidate of the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Interested in questions of international governance, public policy, and food systems, Joanna hopes to explore issues surrounding climate resilient farming and sustainable food futures. Joanna has experience in research, community engagement, and policy development, and she will provide us with a bit of an overview of policy landscape research that she's been doing, really looking at policy development across the country. Following Joanna's presentation, we'll hear some place-based observations from 2 presenters from Montreal. Marie Aubert is an expert in organizational development and public policy. She has over 15 years of experience in federal politics and citizen mobilization. In her role as coordinator of Montreal Métropole Ensemble, Anne-Marie leads the development of the SAM Council, the Food Policy Council of the Montreal metropolitan area. In this capacity, she supports partners in the advancement and implementation of their initiatives. Ms. Aubert provides organizations active in the Montreal food system with places for discussion, sharing, and collaboration with the aim of establishing common intervention strategies for change. Welcome, Joanna and Anne-Marie. Welcome also to Anna-Liisa Aunio, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology at Dawson College in Montreal, Quebec. She's the principal investigator of the Dawson Food Justice and Sustainability Hub at Dawson, which supports local food organizations and networks in Montreal with community-driven research, connections, and coordination on food policy and planning. And last but not the least, we'll hear from Sandra Mark. Sandra's concern for the state of our food systems has focused her community economic development work for many years. She and her partner founded the Small Scale Food Processor Association and have maintained a connection for the past 20 years. She's currently co-managing a project for the association focused on supporting the many women who are creating food products. She's also the economic development manager for the West Boundary area of British Columbia, where she's working with producers to build new meat processing infrastructure. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Joanna, and looking forward to hearing your presentation, Joanna.
Thank you so much, Irena. And thank you so much, Heather, for putting the slides up. So I just want to say thank you, and I'm excited to be on the panel today. As Irena mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate in global governance and have been fortunate enough to be involved in exploring the importance and presence of municipal food policy in Ontario. Some of my efforts build on the incredible work of Kwantlen Polytechnic University's Food Systems Policy Database, which is available in BC and Alberta, thanks to the work of the University of Alberta in concert with KPU. And I am folding in my own experiences in provincial, national, and international forums, looking at local as a site of reform. One thing that has become increasingly clear is the connectivity and multi-directional nature of change. There's an upward flow from those who are working experience in advocating at a local level to other levels of governance, but there's also a downward flow of implementation in some cases, with an emphasis for the need for policy to work for the local. So from local to global, enabling frameworks and complementary efforts can be powerful, but so can spaces of contestation. Contested and complex landscapes can be slow and messy. It can take time to understand different perspectives and create spaces of agency for those who are not part of the dominant paradigm. But this process allows space for critical reflection and can be the precondition for deep change. Community involvement allows for the cracks created in the process of contestation to be filled with critical and essential narratives. Local, provincial, and national, and even international spaces can be at conflict or in concert with one another, and all levels working together to make frameworks that address systemic challenges while empowering place-based thinking can be important. This process can be slower than mainstream policy processes, but it creates space for shaping food policies for resilient regions, which is what we're here to talk about and to discuss today. Increasing emphasis on a robust local system that is inclusive, including responsive regulations and supportive programming, as Sandra will discuss with reference to small-scale processing. The pandemic has shown a light on the nimble ability of local communities to respond and support each other. From local food restaurants that pivoted to small outdoor markets, community spaces turned into distribution sites for food, innovative online platforms connecting growers and eaters adapting, and organizations like FoodShare that implemented ways to partner with social movements to keep people safe and fed. Many of these were occurring before the pandemic, but were able to adjust and keep going. As the role of the nation state evolves, local states of policymaking are of increasing interest to the forums like the United Nations as key partners for issues on areas such as climate change, the implementation of the SDGs, and maybe even food. So, what could these different elements mean for food systems practitioners or advocates? From my perspective, it illustrates an increased, complex, and connected landscape of policy scales. The next slide, please. With local food planning, there's a variety of tools that are used by advocates and municipal policymakers, including official plans, food policy councils, urban agriculture plans, specific strategies, and so much more. The implementation of these tools and processes are not mutually exclusive, but are incorporated or not differently by each community. For example, food policy councils can be embedded within municipal structures or can be external groups of community experts and advocates that provide recommendations to municipal officials or food actors such as institutions. Some of the examples that I've seen in my work include municipalities that go beyond provincial baselines and incorporate ideas of food policy through these tools. This includes food systems planning in London, as the slide shows, public procurement work in Thunder Bay, and food access innovations in Toronto. And Toronto is one of the oldest food policy councils. So also, for anyone who's interested in policy food databases, food council networks, or specific examples, I'll share some in the chat box to explore. Sites such as Food Communities Network, John Hopkins Centre for Livable Future, KPU, FLEdGE, Sustain Ontario, Food Secure Canada, and others all do work in this space. There are other examples in communities across Ontario, and I hope that this work and so many others, planners can leverage these examples to make a difference in their own frameworks. Municipal planners and policymakers are just one element of a local food policy ecosystem. We have growers, eaters, small businesses, markets, community groups, and advocates all working to a robust, resilient system. My work analyzes the framework that these policies are housed in and how to create space or connectivity to enhance change through place-based efforts. Again, I'm so grateful to be here. Sandra's insights on regionally scaled responsive infrastructure, and I'm looking forward to hearing about the work of Anna-Liisa and Anne-Marie and connecting the global to the local from their experience in Montreal. Thank you so much to the FLEdGE team for organizing this panel and the discussion with all of the other Food Engaged participants today.
Thank you, Joanna. For anybody who wants contact information, in case you missed it, Amanda has posted contact information for all the presenters in the chat box, so you can find everybody's profiles and various links if you want to get in touch. Thank you, Joanna. I think we'll move it over to Montreal to hear from Anne-Marie and Anna-Liisa now.
Thank you, and thanks again for the invitation to participate today. Very exciting to be part of this conversation. I'm the coordinator of Montreal's Food Policy Council, the Conseil du Système Alimentaire Montréalais. And we're a very young council. We were created in 2018. We're the first food policy council to be created in Quebec, and the first of any francophone city worldwide. What you're looking at here on the screen is the website of our newly launched integrated action plan that I'll come back to in a second. In terms of the origins of the Food Policy Council, so we're sort of a hybrid form. We're not a municipal entity. The Food Policy Council was created after public consultations for the creation of a Food Policy Council in Montreal. So it's recognized by the City of Montreal, and the City of Montreal participates in the Food Policy Council, but it's actually led by a network of partners that pre-existed the emergence of the council. In partners from all different sectors of the food system who were already working together, but who saw the need to formalize the relationship and to have a place for the interaction between civil society and more governmental institutional partners. So this integrated action plan was the first big project that we worked on. There are 3 different ways that we decided that we're going about putting in place these actions. Just to back up a bit, I should mention that the integrated action plan, why we say integrated, is because it's not just actions or projects that are led by the Food Policy Council or by one of its partners. We put out a call for participation, and it wasn't a call for funding. It was just a call for participation once we had established the different objectives of this plan, so that people who were working on these things all across the city could come together and join forces and share what they're doing. So yes, there are projects that we are leading ourselves as the Food Policy Council. There are other projects that we support in a more specific way by being on an orientation committee or providing funding. But our main role is to bring together all these different people who are working together or who are working we're working separately towards the same objectives. We want to bring them together so that they'll be able to share best practices and talk about the challenges that we're having. So this is kind of the result that we're looking at, but today I wanted to talk a little bit more about the process and the value of the process that we went through for the strategic planning, because it was an opportunity for people to decide on a shared understanding of the challenges that face our food system. And this is really necessary for forming the basis for any kind of policy action. So while in our action plan, there are all kinds of very concrete projects, in terms of policy, it was much more the process that made it possible for us to come together and work on this. And why that's important in terms of going back to the theme of bridging the local and the global is because we know that many of the policies that have an impact on our food system go beyond the jurisdiction of the city. The city itself isn't in any formal way responsible for the issues of food security either. But through this process of creating a shared understanding of what are the issues, what are the directions that we want to go in, we were able to, first of all, come to the creation and sort of the consolidation of the Food Policy Council itself. And it, as we took on the form of this more formal structure, and it brought us a form of recognition, and it also brought us into a network of partners outside of Montreal. So global networks like the Milan Food Policy Pact or other networks that exist, allowing for us to share not only what we're working on and what are the policies that we want to put in place here, but to also be inspired by what people are doing around the world. And this bolsters our capacity to work together as a common front on the city level when we're in the face of or in interaction with other levels of government or decision making that impact us that we want to have an influence on. So I'm going over my time. I will stop there. Hope we have more time to discuss later.
Anna-Liisa, go ahead.
So can you hear me, everybody? It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to actually present with Anne-Marie. We've been working together for a bit now, and the process that has been put together by the CSAM and the council itself in relation to the most recent strategic plan has really been collaborative and engaging, and I congratulate you on that in terms of actually the successful launch. It was just launched this past month, so with a new website, and we're happy to participate in several projects that are coordinated and organized by the Food Policy Council. Interestingly, while Anne-Marie talks about food policy councils as a nexus between the local and the global and thinking about structures that facilitate participation and engagement in relation to multiple partners coming together to create food policies that has the capacity to be far more collaborative and diverse in terms of actually the perspectives that are brought to the table. A lot of the focus is on the process and the structure, which is actually important in terms of actually setting up the arrangements for people to be able to actually participate and for them to meaningfully participate in any consultation process as well as any strategic plan. The reason I have put this particular graph up in terms of actually the work that I do is that I focus far more at the local level and thinking about the relationships on the ground between organizations within particular neighborhoods. And those might be quite separate actually from thinking about the processes that are put in place or the governance structure that is actually established to facilitate future participation in a network. In response to the questions in relation to this seminar and in relation to the other presentations, when we ask why local neighborhoods and the local is significant in terms of actually understanding resilience and being able to respond more effectively in a resilient fashion and a transformative fashion in relation to food policy, the local really is a place where innovation happens. We all live and think about ourselves within the context of cities. I think of myself as a Montrealer and hopefully soon as a Canadian. And that participation in terms of actually the process itself as citizens and as residents has certain kinds of meanings for us, but we live and we act and we work on an everyday basis within our neighborhoods. And those places are meaningful for us in terms of actually understanding how we relate to each other as not just citizens, but as residents. And in terms of actually thinking about the organizations that are active within within neighborhoods, their coordination and collaboration with each other to deliver food services or to deliver interventions in the food system often happens first at the neighborhood level or at the local level. And so I'd like to think about the local here in terms of actually the connections is that these are the actual linkages between local organizations and who've actually responded to a survey about who they actually collaborate with. And you can see the thick level of collaboration here at the local level. This is actually a municipal authority that says that they collaborate with quite a lot. But within the context of this particular neighborhood, you can see the strong, thick connections that are typically invisible to us in terms of actually thinking about municipal structures, about our citizen engagement in particular practices. They are the bread and butter, however, of our engagement in thinking about how transformation actually happens. They're the experts on the ground in terms of actually thinking about what the issues are at the neighborhood level. I know we like to sometimes think that good data and experts from other levels, such as myself as a researcher, can actually provide some insight in terms of actually the issues on the ground. But what we find often in terms of actually thinking about our analyses is that they fail to actually have any meaningful impact unless they're actually brought together with the community-based organizations that can provide answers to some of the most basic questions in terms of actually the implementation of particular projects. And so this is a social network that is laid on top of a geographic relationships or geolocated data in the Southwest borough of Montreal. And it just actually demonstrates the connections that these organizations have with one another. They were asked specifically who they collaborate with within the neighborhood and then also outside of the neighborhood. And you can see that most of the action is here at the neighborhood level. And again, they were asked about other areas or other partners, but it's here in terms of actually where the meaningful connections happen, and understanding these kinds of networks and who talks to whom and who collaborates with whom is central to thinking about the impact of our interventions as well. So we can come up with the most beautiful policy in the entire world. We can come up with this fantastic structure. We can actually deliver that. As researchers, we often talk about this in relation to thinking about the research that we do. Here's my research, go run with it. And you make the change when actually we fail to translate it into something that's actionable. And community organizations and local partnerships are central to actually thinking about that. And they're also finally central to thinking about the issue of resilience in terms of understanding how we actually survive pandemics like COVID-19, how we actually innovate in relation to thinking about responses to those things. And in this structure, we saw a huge amount of innovation at the neighborhood level and at the community level in response to actually the very real needs on the ground for both supply chains as well as issues of food insecurity. But it's also, to answer the second question that we talk about, important to extend ourselves beyond the community, because often in sharing the innovations that happen within our neighborhoods, we can impact and we can reach and we can amplify all of the successful efforts that have been engaged with in local communities and expand them across the city. In other words, this is a bottom-up process and actually thinking about innovation coming from the ground up. And to a certain extent, you talk a bit about market logics in relation to local neighborhoods. And what I find in terms of actually the neighborhoods themselves is that they are innovating also in relation to thinking about those market logics. And so that's important to think about as we understand their impact broadly. And so with that, I'm at my time and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much for everybody. And thank you, Anne-Marie, for your presentation.
Thank you both. That was wonderful. And I think what you wrapped up with is a perfect segue to Sandra Mark's presentation. When we're thinking about food systems resilience and how we build robust food systems, Sandra, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here with a bunch of such powerful women. I'd like to start with a personal story. My grandfather, when he was 17, decided he wanted to come to Canada. And he heard about the free land in Alberta, of course, not recognizing anything related to First Nations and all of that. That's another story. But he convinced his family to come to Alberta. And between his mother and his brothers, they proved up a large number of acres, I think 1,000 or something, and they grew wheat. They grew the most wonderful wheat. But my great-grandmother was really concerned because she had to go to the general store to get flour. And so she put her sons into a company and they built the first two wheat mills in Alberta. And I'm telling you this story because she was one of hundreds of people across the country who built small factories in their areas. We had fish factories and cheese factories and jam factories and meat factories. We had all kinds of factories all over the country. And of course, now we don't have those factories anymore. But part of the work that I'm involved with the Small Scale Food Processor Association, is to look at why we don't have those factories and what can we be doing about it. Currently, the majority of the food that is on the shelves in stores is the result of about 5 or 6 huge corporations. They have done their best to knock out all the small guys. So we have a very interesting process here. Slide, thanks. So I'll just be talking a little bit about food system infrastructure and food policy. This little clip art here shows you how complicated you get an apple at your tree, and all these things have to happen before the apples come down to us in the community. Slide. So we all have been talking about the issues facing local food systems. The farm income crisis, to me, is one of the really huge problems. It's really hard for farmers to make a dollar, and so we're losing farms at a very fast rate. The climate crisis is having impact on the way farmers have to plan their crops and change their crops and do things differently. It's actually having a huge impact on food security. And then my point about corporate control, and I think most people here understand that. And then, of course, trade policies that focus on trying to get us to export our products and import products from someplace else rather than feeding ourselves. Slide. So the result of all this has been a decimation of our ability to feed ourselves in Canada. Slide. So the question we are all speaking about now, can bioregional, regional, local food systems be rebuilt? We all know that sustainable agriculture is based on small scale, diverse farming and local and regional production. However, we're severely lacking in our capacity to do these things right now. Slide. So what we're concerned about through the Small Scale Food Processor Association and the work we're doing with Irena, Carleton University, and other universities across the country right now is trying to figure out how can we make bioregional food systems economically viable. So there's certain pieces in this we have to look at. Regional planning, which we've been discussing today, and then how does that go on to relationships with local ownership? And then how do we deal with bioregional food production infrastructure? And then how do we get the investment needed? So all these pieces are critically important for building regional food systems. I'm quite interested in the fact that a recent study done showed that investment into the food system in Canada is really lacking. And it's quite interesting with the work we're doing, looking at women's role in small scale food processing. We recognize that there's thousands of women across the country trying to create their own business, making food that will address some of their health issues, celebrate their grandmother's wonderful recipes, bring their ethnic recipes to the marketplace. All these women are trying to figure out how to make an economy for themselves and their family and contribute to the local food system. Slide. So interestingly, 94.5% of processors in Canada are small. And small is defined in various ways, but it's less than 100 people working in your factory. Well, the fact of the matter is most of those small guys are micros and very small. In BC, we imagine there's about 20 and less workers in a small company. So we have all these people making food products, and we believe that we need to develop small-scale food processing infrastructure to support bioregional food security. Okay. So just a little bit about the Small Scale Food Processor Association. We're working really hard on creating an ecosystem of support for small scale food processors with incubation, accelerator, access to finance, mentorship, and peer support. And we're also working nationally because we believe that all of this effort that we're making all across the country to understand our food system really needs to go to a national forum. So I have to thank Irena and her role in helping us bring those forward to the people who maybe will actually listen to us now, because COVID has made it clear that we have a problem with our food system. Those of us who've been working with it for many long years have known it for a long, long time, but it's kind of a good point. Good time to try and make our points really get in there and make things change. Thank you.
Thank you all for those great presentations. And I know it's really hard to get your points across in such a short time frame, but I'd like to move into the second part of this webinar where we actually get the panelists to discuss what they just shared. Before I ask my first question, I do want to just observe that we heard the word planning quite a bit over the last half an hour. So I want to put in a quick plug for our colleagues at Quantum Polytech University, the Institute for Sustainable Food Systems. There right now is conducting a survey of planners in training, or folks who are somehow involved in food systems planning across the country. So if you're interested in participating in that survey or know somebody who would, please visit their website and find the survey link. It's available in both French and English. But I will move on to my first question, which is, we hear quite a bit from our presenters about how policy landscapes can be challenging and sometimes present barriers to a robust and resilient food system. And at the same time, we are talking about planning, and planning is really about kind of futuring, imagining what our future is going to be like. So the question I want to put to our panelists is, it sounds like there's many great food initiatives that are already contributing to food systems. And these initiatives are more socially just and kinder to human and environmental well-being, as the work all of you are doing. So if that is already happening, with the kind of challenging and limiting policy landscapes, what kind of a food system do you think is possible if we also have policy frameworks that support such initiatives, this kind of grassroots work? What do you imagine? Blue sky. Sandra, you're unmuted, so maybe you can start.
Okay. Well, blue sky, of course, I'd like to see the effort that small-scale food processors, usually on their own, are trying to scale up their own operations. I really would like to see us look at bioregional cooperation to rebuild regional infrastructure. This is happening in a few places in BC right now, which is quite exciting, and across the country there's examples. But if we can't actually preserve our food for the many months of the year that we can't get fresh food, then we're really missing part of the boat. So looking at how we can actually refinance our way to food security is a critical importance to the thinking that I'm involved in right now.
Great, thank you, Sandra. Anne-Marie?
Yeah, for me, I think that we have a great opportunity right now in the, not quite the aftermath yet, but with looking at the impact of COVID and all the attention that it's brought to the breaches in our food system. There's a renewed interest on the part of policy makers, and the work that has been done already within all the local projects on the ground has made it so that there are already these pilot projects that are ready to be scaled up. So to give an example, in Montreal, in our action plan, there are already 92 projects. But just recently, in the wake of the first wave, the metropolitan region of Montreal, so going beyond the urban center, but the body that encompasses all of the surrounding regions, sorry, I'm translating in my head at the same time, has put in place a table on food security, and that table is led really by this supra-municipal structure. So it's a governmental structure, so it's bringing in the ministries, and they're asking us, what are the projects that can be scaled up now? And so when I look at the future, it's to take all these things that have been happening in terms of innovation on a small scale, bringing them up to another level, and creating those links between the urban center and the more productive regions around us.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I'm going to be like a relentless journalist and just probe you a little more. So Sandra specifically mentioned regional infrastructure as part of this kind of support system that could encourage some of the initiatives that are already doing great work. What support specifically do you think the initiatives in Montreal would need to scale up?
So funding? There's definitely, well, funding is always a need. Right now, there are a lot of opportunities for funding that are coming down the pipe through the Ministry of Agriculture, through emergency funds as well, but some of the funders are starting to think more long-term in terms of resilience for those funds as well. But I think definitely in terms of processing, there's a big gap. As Sandra was saying, we sort of had a shock in Quebec and in Montreal during COVID in the first wave, when all of a sudden we realized that because the abattoirs in Alberta were closed, that there wasn't any more beef coming our way. And people kind of looked around and said, well, what happened to all the abattoirs? Well, they're gone. They all got centralized. So that was a big wake-up call. There's a need for that local, that type of local infrastructure. And then also a lot of needs around the last mile transport. You know, we have huge congestion issues. We want to be cognizant of the environmental impact of that transport. So thinking through that and reworking those systems is also going to be crucial.
Great, thank you. Anna-Liisa, would you like to add anything to this?
That's complicated. I guess from what I see in terms of actually the biggest challenges, but then also something that is, I would love to imagine, is the reduction of inequality in general in relation to the food system that has like differential impacts across different neighborhoods. And so you have certain neighborhoods that are just surrounded by fast food, and it would be great to see fresh, affordable food to be flowing freely within and available to all. And so that's quite complicated in terms of actually thinking about the structures that are in place in relation to our food system broadly. But I like the regional component of this, and especially if you think about connecting local communities to neighborhoods or to areas outside of Montreal, for example, specifically to do community supported agriculture, and there's some great initiatives that are providing baskets through DEPs and letting fresh food flow into those neighborhoods that's affordable. And I think the last thing I would say is that there's this, in relation to inequality, there's this disjuncture, I think, right now between gardening and urban agriculture initiatives and growing food and thinking about greening our cities in relation to that, where it's seen as accessible to some and not accessible to others. And I would love to see, again, a diversification of that. Right now in Montreal, if you want to actually get a community garden plot, it's 3 years waiting, and it's officially 3 years, but it's actually like 10. And there's a lack of access or ability to be able to identify areas where you can actually grow food or to engage like as a collective, as a collectivity in relation to anybody who wants to get to do something new in relation to growing food. And so there's been efforts to say, hey, that land over there looks empty and nobody's been using it for ages. Can we actually get together and use it? And the ways in which you can actually access that and find the information that you need, as well as be able to use that land is a morass right now. The city's a black box to a certain extent in terms of information and capabilities, which is why the CSAM is so important.
Great. I was hoping you would go last on this question, Joanna, partly because we have these interesting examples of possible futures from a sector-specific perspective, like Sandra is providing. So it's looking at processing Canada-wide, but that specific aspect, specific component of the food system. From Anne-Marie and Anna-Liisa, we heard more about the place-based thinking and that place-based perspective, but you have a sort of a broader zoomed out view of food policies. So could you speak a little bit to this question of what kind of a food future could we have if we had supportive policies?
Yeah, absolutely. I will try to touch on both and connect them. But I think one of the big things is planning ahead and planning integrated. So thinking ahead on what might be needed for food systems reform, but for building that kind of capacity that's essential. And I think planning integrated, both across scales, but across issue base. So, food security is not siloed off from other issues that are experienced and that might be more systemic. And so thinking about a way that policy can be planned more integrated and with a future perspective in mind. And so basic things that I just think about is land, urban planning, transit, social programming. All of these play critical and key roles in inclusive environments. And in particular, Anne-Marie, I know you noted the last mile. And Sandra, I know that you were talking about food processing. So looking at ways to support and sustain abilities of regions and local communities to have that kind of capacity. And doing this in concert with one another rather than in isolation, I think is really important.
Great, thank you. I think that's a really great way to wrap up the discussion on that first question. And you also gave me a really good segue to the next question, which really touches on scale. And again, you all talked about scale in terms of regional infrastructure, municipal policies, local food networks, and all of these things seem to offer promise. Even though when we think about local solutions, they really run counter to the current market logic and how we think about sort of the global economic system. Why, in your opinion, is local action so critical for food systems resilience? And maybe we can start in Montreal again, given your local focus, Anna-Liisa and Anne-Marie. Anna-Liisa?
Yeah, I'll go first. I think, as I said, I think that's where a lot of innovation is occurring, and that's where ideas are first tested out and tried, and where you can really learn the lessons of implementation in relation to initiatives in general, and where a lot of creativity happens from local actors and local collaborations. There's and also those innovations apply to the actual thinking about market logic. And so you see these hybrid organizations that are actually engaging citizens and communities together, but at the same time are coordinating with one another to actually be sustainable financially in the long term, and to be self-sustaining financially. And that, we typically think of co-ops and other kinds of arrangements as the first thing that comes to mind. But in Verdun, there was this fantastic initiative where a bunch of citizens took over the greenhouse. The greenhouse had gone unused because after essentially the demerger that happened, and the merger happened in Montreal. And they had all these neighborhoods had these local greenhouses that were where they grew flowers to actually distribute to the community. And it was being used as storage space. So they discovered it or rediscovered it and took over that greenhouse and established an organization that collaboratively and cooperatively takes care of the greenhouse and also grows food there and rents out the space and also provides opportunities for volunteering. And so you see these wonderful kind of hybrid initiatives that really defy and cause us to question thinking about not just the market logic of thinking about the large corporate structures that normally come to mind, but then also how we can scale up these kinds of initiatives in relation to thinking about full systems transformation. So you talk about scaling up and scaling out, rely specifically on these kinds of experiments. And I think it's important to learn the lessons of the local in relation to it.
Great, thank you. Marie, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Anna-Liisa framed it perfectly, and maybe I'll just give two other examples of some of these innovations that show potential. So in Montreal right now, we have a lot of nonprofit organizations who are moving towards a more social economy model, so that they're engaging with this market logic, and it has there are all kinds of challenges associated with that. There's all kinds of innovations going on, but one that I would mention is this idea. That's la tarification sociale. So I'm going to translate it as social pricing. That's probably not the right word in English, but basically experimenting with different ways to modulate the price of food depending on the people who are buying the food. So whether through, suggested donation or other systems to modulate the pricing to adapt the price of the food to the means of the people who are buying it. Is one thing that's going on. And another thing is there's a project right now which really marries food security and supporting local producers. So it's kind of a agriculture supported by the community model, but basically there are prepaid cards organizations who offer food aid. Rather than giving a basket of food, they give a prepaid card to the family who's in need, and then the family can go to the local food markets, specific local food markets, and they can use that card to buy food that comes from local producers. So at the same, you get various benefits like, well, we're directly supporting the local producers. There's more choice for the family who gets to choose what kind of products they want to have rather than just taking whatever in the basket. So all kinds of innovations like that are going on in terms of on the local scale, teasing out these issues of sort of traditional models of food aid and moving towards a market logic.
Thank you. Maybe I'll come back to you, Joanna, and then wrap up this question with Sandra's response, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the scale question.
So I think from the nimbleness and the innovation that happens at the local level is phenomenal. And I think it was there before the pandemic, but has been really able to adapt and address the needs of communities, in particular in instances where the structures were already there. I think one of the things that I would say the local points to is this importance of a question of policy embedded or policy enabled and locally empowered and embedded. So taking approaches that allow for the flexibility for communities to respond and creating frameworks that allow for that to exist. And there's a lot of discussion around responsive regulation. And so identifying opportunities for regulations being more nimble to address the needs of smaller processors or smaller food spaces within communities. I think that the scale of the everyday realities can really illustrate what reform should and could be and provide opportunities for sharing information and experiences between places. So while things aren't directly translatable between communities, I think learning from each other is a really great opportunity. And it also provides examples for other scales of governance to look at and allows for scales of governance to question how to work better together to achieve that.
Great, thank you. Sandra, I'll come back to you now to talk about local action and scale.
Yes, I think it's really important to differentiate between food security for people who are low income and are marginalized in our society and food security for everybody. Your example about how suddenly there wasn't any meat on the shelves or in the coolers, I think is a really good example of how when this pandemic has pointed all this stuff out, but we're so concerned about marginalized people and people of low income and the food system. And interesting enough, a survey was done a few years ago that showed in the prairies that the biggest users of food banks were farmers. So to me, the people we have to really be concerned about are the people who actually know how to grow food and the people who actually know how to make food. So I just want to jump on my soapbox a little bit about that, because I think we have to be very careful. As well, I think what happens is I've just been involved with a group that want to be the center of the world, the most important people who are doing this kind of stuff. And I think that kind of we're the center of the world piece is problematic. So your points about we have to collaborate across the country, I think is really important, and collaborate with each other. So I'm thinking a lot about the word ecosystem these days, and entrepreneurial ecosystems. We talk about ecosystems as all the pieces we need to make happen, but in the business world, ecosystems that are structured in such a fashion that they actually become a point of energy development, I think is really important for us to look at, so that we say, okay, let's talk about an ecosystem that goes from the grassroots all the way up, that will actually become supporting all the pieces of that ecosystem moving forward, so that what we learn locally we can put into a place where it will actually have impact nationally, impact across the country. And I think that's one of the pieces that we haven't really planned for as effectively as we might do. So I hope that as a result of some of these conversations, we can begin to see how that linkage at the local level, at the provincial level, can become a national voice. Because I know we, through the Small Scale Food Processor Association, have been sitting for 20 years on the food processor industry roundtable with all the deputy ministers of all the departments of the government that are concerned with food one way or the other. And the issues facing small operators never come onto that table. We keep sitting there in hopes that someday it might, but it's just our organization. So we really want more people to back up the kind of work that's going on, so that where we have a voice in the places that actually can have impact going forward and on the larger policy framework. So yes, we need to learn stuff locally. We need to learn stuff regionally. We need to build a bigger world for ourselves, so that we don't just think we're the center and that we're the only ones doing stuff, because we're all doing this stuff. We got to get ourselves together. We got to organize big time, as far as I'm concerned.
Great, thank you, Sandra. I really like that phrase, that some of these local initiatives are points of energy development. I think that's a very useful way to think about them. And I feel like you have all started to answer this last question we have. And just for the attendees, a reminder, we have about another 10 minutes to discuss this last question. I know some questions have already been popped into the Q&A box, and a couple of them have been answered. But we will stop at 1 o'clock, take a 5-minute break, and then regroup for a coffee chat if you would all like to join us for that. But the last question I have for our panelists, and as I already mentioned, you all have sort of started to answer this a little bit, but local action is important, but we also heard from all of you how working across scales is similarly important. So despite local action being essential, you also all speak about multi-scalar collaboration, networking, and thinking beyond just local policies. Why is working beyond just your communities important to what you do? So that's the first part of the question. And wrapped up in that is also, do you find that these efforts, so I'm thinking, Sandra working with small scale community embedded businesses, but trying to develop a national network, do you find that these efforts to network and work across scales also deplete the energy left to accomplish things locally? So why is it important to network, and is it hard? I'm looking for
I'll start.
Yes.
Can I start with why it's hard?
Yeah.
Especially thinking about local organizations that have very different experiences and goals in relation to thinking about what their relationship is to the community. And, it's important to recognize that, yes, in some situations, organizations are committed to providing emergency food aid, and it's important, and they provide an essential service in terms of actually thinking about addressing direct needs within a neighborhood, et cetera, but to also respect that there are limitations and their abilities end there in terms of actually what they think, what their engagement is. That's different than some of the initiatives that we've been talking about in terms of actually the innovations. And I think in that context, it's more important to actually network. But the challenges associated with that is that if you look at resources and funding, there's never resources and funding to provide organizations with the capacity to be able to do that. There's typically the effort to, or the need to, or based on funders' priorities, the need to demonstrate how successful you are and then end the project and seek more funding. And there's little like long-term capacity building in terms of actually thinking about local neighborhoods and communities. And this is a big thing that I tend to think about in relation to this. There's little respect for productive failure. I think it's important for us to understand that sometimes we learn in the process of doing, and that's a valuable lesson in saying that didn't work. And we need to consider that in the context of how funding is structured and how we're set up for organizations to reflect on and to be able to build on those insights and to be more capable and honest of reflecting on those and being able to share those experiences. I think sometimes we get into this process where we're chasing funding consistently and we have to say, we did this and this was great and look how wonderful we are, and not fully share or recognize our like frustrations and failures as well as our successes. And that I've been in one community that did that. It was really compelling in terms of actually thinking about the support that people provided to each other, and then also the advice and the making yourself vulnerable like that in terms of this actually is a real opportunity for learning. And so I think there's multiple challenges, but that particular challenges in relation to funding and resources is a massive one that has other like filtered and deleterious consequences in the long term in terms of actual meaningful connection.
Thank you for that very frank answer, Anna-Liisa. Anne-Marie, do you want to chime in on this?
Sure. I'd actually like to turn the question a little bit on its head because, in some ways, like Anna-Liisa mentioned, it's hard to network and to work in this fashion. But in other ways, it's very easy. It's very enjoyable. The food movement is great. There's a lot of wonderful people. I worked in politics before. This is fabulous. So it's easy. Like we had, I go back to the launch of the Food Policy Council, and there was really this, it's a lot of energy, but we're kind of patting ourselves on the back. Oh, look at, now we have a Food Policy Council and get to work with all these great people. Well, we haven't actually solved any problems yet. So I think while there's dangers or risks associated with the hard work that it takes to do the networking, it's also important to not get caught up in the idea that, oh, isn't this great? Now we have this body, isn't this great? Now we're talking to all these like-minded people. And that's where it's important to invest in those links with local practitioners, with small business owners, with people who are really on the front lines to kind of keep us honest and to keep us focused on the things that we're actually trying to achieve. Because sometimes it's a little bit too easy to just feel really good about what we're doing and forget about what we're trying to accomplish.
Thank you. Sandra, maybe I'll turn it over to you next. You're still on mute?
Yeah, okay, there you go.
So why is it important to be networking, and why is it hard too?
I think I agree with the points that Anna-Liisa and Anne-Marie have been making. They're very important points. I think one of the pieces that we have to consider is that the people involved in this conversation are coming from different worldviews. We have the nonprofit community development worldview, and we have the business worldview, the market logic. And I think these two things have got to connect. We have to connect to these things. And the rise of social enterprise, the whole social economy that's moving forward, I think is a way for us to jump from our nonprofit hat into looking at how we can be drivers in the economy. In my view, that's absolutely critical. And I know there's a lot of resistance. I think that people who are concerned about the community and the people who are challenged and marginalized and all this kind of stuff, when you come along and say, well, let's look at a market solution here, I've had many experiences where they say, what are you talking about? I mean, that would be crazy. But I think in my view, having seen this move towards that integration of those two worldviews is critical. And I also find that when those discussions start opening, again, like Anne-Marie says, it becomes quite exciting. So the excitement factor, I think, can drive our networking. And we need to be exciting. We need to really look at those innovations. We need to share the brilliance that's emerging, and we need to capitalize on that by turning these things into market opportunities.
Great. Thank you. And as it seems to have been happening for the entire hour, everybody keeps giving me really great segues. So you just spoke about integration, and Joanna was speaking about integration earlier, although in terms of policies, but it does seem very fitting to give you the final word in these last few minutes, Joanna.
Thank you, Irena. And I just want to build on everyone's points because I think they fit together actually really, really nicely. And one thing it makes me think or go back to, and I'm sorry to repeat myself, but I think connecting it to systemic change and connecting it to this really important need for increased agency, for increased spaces within community to be part of not just their own scale of governance, but also parts of different scales of governance. I even think all the way up to the international, where there's these discussions happening, whether it's cities coming in as implementers of the SDGs, whether it's the role of groups at the Committee on World Food Security. I think there are these opportunities that are really unique and incredible for people to engage in different scales of governance. But I think that there's also an importance of, let's say, something like food insecurity. That discussion is also embedded in broader questions around poverty and basic income and importance of social programming. And so I think local isn't going to solve problems on their own, but working in tandem with enabling frameworks can really create that environment that, and to use, sorry, the words that I did earlier, but could be the precondition for deep-seated change, right? And so deep-seated change across scale, which I think could really, really be powerful. And ultimately, to loop it back to a word in the title of the presentation, resilient. So it might be harder, it might take longer, but it also might be more resilient in terms of policy. So
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you, Joanna. So before we take a break now, in a minute or so, just a quick reminder to everybody that there's a Q&A box and a chat box open still for your questions. We'll regroup at about 5 minutes after 1 for a coffee chat. Before I wrap it up, I want to extend my really big thank yous to all of our panelists for great insights and loads of really great knowledge and experience and insight. Also, big shout out to the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems and its director, Dr. Alison Blake-Palmer, for hosting this webinar series. And a reminder to follow FLEdGE Research on Twitter if you want to find out about more of the webinars that are coming up down the pipe. And last but not least, a big thank you to Heather Reed and Amanda DiBattista for organizing and running this webinar today. So we'll take a break now and we'll regroup at about 5 minutes after 1 for a coffee chat. To all the attendees, I hope you can join us, but if you can't, thank you so much for participating in this first hour, and I hope you will join us for the future webinars as well. Context. I've worked on supply chain security and understand the generalities, but not food specifically. As a landowner, citizen, hobbyist farmer, I'm very interested in learning more about food specifically and steps I can take to increase it locally. This question comes from the UK. So the question is, what is the #1 resource, any form of media, the panel members would like to point me at to learn more about food security?
I can start with that, Irena, if you want, and I can, Sherry, I can just pop a few resources into the chat, and if any of the other panelists want to build off of it. Off the top of my head, I can think of Proof, which comes at food security from an income perspective. York University also has some resources, as well as the Yellowhead Institute. So I will put those 3 in the chat, and if anybody wants to build on that, that would be great.
Wonderful. Would anybody else like to chime in?
Yeah, I just like to look at the difference between a supply chain and a value chain. I think we have all the big companies talk about supply chains, and these are often so controlled that, you know, local or regional people can't kind of get in there. But if we shift to value chains, if we look at how we can build from seed to plate all the different actors in our area, then we can start looking at a different way to create supply. And so I just would like to point out there's a lot of research has been done on value chain development, and I'd like to suggest that that's something people should be looking at.
Great, thank you. Anything to add from Montreal? Not at this point, that's okay. Sherry has said thank you. So I'll move on to the next question. This comes from an anonymous attendee. The question is directed at Anna-Liisa, but I think all of our panelists can probably speak to this question. So the question goes like this. Anna-Liisa mentioned how projects are never really completed and placed on the community to figure out. I also agree with this. The community is basically put into the role of figuring out how to complete the project, the action part. Have you seen any projects to be successfully completed with all stakeholders involved? Wow, this is a good question. If not, what are the challenges that adhere to this problem? How can we move forward in seeing the action part without placing pressure on the focus community itself to figure it out? Wow, this is a tough question. Anna-Liisa, I put you on
That's a really tough question. Yeah, I think in placing some of the ownership, like if we turn it around a little bit, like, yes, things are placed on the community, but if we empower communities to have ownership over the actual experiences and the like model itself and the implementation, that's a different kind of perspective that changes the relationship between, say, funders and, you know, people who are setting priorities for projects and groups that are trying to figure themselves out or figure out what the ways that they're going to interact with each other, as well as the solutions that they see on the ground. And so I think to a certain extent, it needs to require community engagement and collaboration and like stakeholder and the full participation, largely because that's how, you know, as I said, the experts in terms of actually the implementation of things are usually at the community or local level. That said, there's usually, there's not a lot of support for that kind of work, and there's not a lot of resources for that kind of work. And, you know, Sandra, you've talked specifically about value chains and shifting our focus, and there are a lot of incredible initiatives that are trying to do that and to try and bring together the like NGO and even the charitable model, you know, and marry it or bring it together with thinking about the social economy models. And there's been some incredible stuff, but that's always an extra and an add-on and like a burden that becomes part of the extra things that they have to do in order to build a sense of sustainability over time. And so there's an organization around the corner from me that started off just doing Meals on Wheels, or just doing, but like Meals on Wheels, and now has a farm and has a, you know, a farm stand. But all of that has like required an incredible investment on the part of people who are really, really committed and who are usually not paid well to invest in that. And that, I think, there should be more opportunities for us to kind of provide resources and foundations and funding to kind of empower local organizations and to be able to put in that work and to be able to spend the time on reflecting on and being able to collaborate with each other. And there's usually not the capacity to do that, but there's also not support for it. I don't mean to sound negative, but in terms of actually, I'm just, you know, drawing attention to the barriers. Okay.
Great, thank you. Joanna, you just unmuted yourself. Would you like to chime in?
Just two quick things. One, I'm just trying to pull up the specifics, but there is examples of specific institutions or communities working to identify parts of regulations that are really problematic and working to change. And so proposing solutions on how to adjust those. The Minneyawan Health Center, which is in Sioux Lookout in Ontario, I believe is an example of an institution that's done this in collaboration with community to identify and access game meats within the health center. And so I think there's kind of the specific part, which is very specific, or not very specific, but specific issues that intersect with problematic regulations or policies that can be advocated for. But then there's this broader framework side, which is the part that I emphasized more so in my presentation, which is discussions around creating what I would refer to more as enabling frameworks. And so allowing the latitude and flexibility of communities to engage in a broader framework that's going to work for them. And part of that is looking at how different regions might be different in how they define resiliency, but what might be common. And so I think creating that enabling element within policy is really important to empower those changes.
Great. I'm wondering also if I can put Sandra on the spot with this question. Sandra, thinking specifically about your years of experience as a community developer, not just in terms of food, if you can think of some examples to offer to this question. Do you want me to read the question again?
No, it's fine. I actually have a thought I'd like to put out there, and that is, I think it's really important for us to understand where we can have intervention, where we can make change. And for example, one of the places that is moving forward, I was involved quite a long time ago with the idea of trying to get the University of Victoria, where I had worked for several years, to buy local food. And because I was working with farmers co-op that wanted to scale up their operations. So we did a two-pronged effort. We went to the purchasing department and we convinced them that their carbon footprint could be reduced because they were paying money out on their carbon footprint. We gave them all the documentation they needed to be able to show that by buying local food, they would reduce their carbon footprint obligations. And then we organized the students to raise heck about the fact that they weren't eating good food. And the result was that the University of Victoria moved from a 3% local food to 80%. This required them to change their daily policies of purchasing. And in fact, they were willing to do it because they were so embarrassed by a meeting with farmers that I'd organized where a woman farmer, bless her heart, stood up and pounded on the table and said, "How can I send my kids to your university if you don't buy my food?" And the result was that he just said, "Okay, fine, what do I have to do?" And he became a huge advocate for institutional purchasing. So I think we need to look at where we can intervene and make some real good change. We can't wait for the big guys up there to figure it out. We've got to figure it out, and we've got to find where those intervention points are.
Great. Anne-Marie, you don't have to answer this. We don't have to hear from all panelists, but I do want to give you an opportunity if you had something to add. You're good? Okay. We have one question still in the Q&A, and there was also another question that popped up in the chat box, but I'll go with the Q&A question because it came up a few minutes ago from our old friend Faris Ahmed. So Faris asks, is there more space scope for centering local as perhaps the key sphere where change can come from? Is there evidence that local is gaining more prominence in policy making? Otherwise, we're often having to justify the local level as somehow inferior, even as demonstrated in the language of bottom up. What are your thoughts on this, our dear panelists? Joanna was first, and then we'll go to Sandra.
Hi, Faris. Thank you. I think that's a really great question. And I tried to build that in at the end of the webinar with my reference to the Committee on World Food Security. So I think there really is a great opportunity for cities and local spaces and initiatives to have a voice, especially when it comes to maybe the alternative to a dominant paradigm that might exist in that space. And agroecology is a space that we've seen a lot of, well, and Faris, you could speak to this much better than I could, but from my understanding has been a space where you see a lot of that local and a lot of that alternative and contestation with the dominant, and provides an opportunity for an alternative voice. So I would say there is space. I would hope there's more space in the future because it really provides a good grounding.
Great. Thank you. Sandra, we'll go to you because you unmuted yourself too.
Yeah,
so
I'd just like to say that I think often local initiatives come forward to different levels of government, more or less kind of blaming them for not doing their job, which of course they should be blamed for not doing their job, but maybe they don't know how to do their job. So I think it's really important that when we go forward, we do the same work that we do in community. We find out who are they, where are they at, and how could we help them win? So I think we have to be extremely clever about how we bring local issues to other levels of government or other levels of discussion. That we come there with really good ideas about how they, whoever they might be, could become part of the solution. And having myself been involved many times in going forward and marching around and doing everything you possibly can, say do things differently. By shifting to look at how they win too, we've been able to make some really big changes.
Great, thank you. Anne-Marie, I did see you unmute yourself earlier, so I'm assuming you have something to add to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be a balance between making sure that those local perspectives and needs and the reality gets communicated and in that positive or constructive way that Sandra's talking about. But I also think that we need to be careful about presenting the local level of intervention as an easy place for people at other levels to kind of slough off the responsibility for taking care of these problems. So, you know, a classic example I think would be like the charitable model. Well, you know, we are doing our part to end food security, not because we're working on policies or because we're tackling the issues of poverty, but because we give lots of money to these local food banks. So that, you know, emphasizing the role of the local, but also being very clear about what that role is and what it isn't, I think are two things that need to be done simultaneously.
Great. Anna-Liisa, would you like to add anything to that? No? Good. We do have one more question in the chat box that actually has already been partly answered, but maybe not fully. This question came from Azar Ahmed, who wanted to know if the FLEdGE network and the panelists focus on food solutions solely in Canada. And what this attendee wants to know is more about urban agriculture initiatives from the developing world that budding initiatives can learn from. In particular, this is somebody who is working on an urban agriculture initiative in the city of Karachi, Pakistan. So there was a few answers popped into the box, and Alison Blay-Palmer has joined us, so I'll put her on the spot in a second, but I will, if that's okay with you, Alison. But I also want to add that FLEdGE does do quite a bit of international collaboration. And we also, even if we don't, some of us who don't necessarily do international work, we do have connections and recommendations for some of those things. But Alison has been really key to connecting most of us in the FLEdGE network with a lot of the international partners, collaborators, and just kindred spirits. Because of her really heavy involvement in some of the international food initiatives. So Alison, I'm hoping that you have a good connection and you can chime in on this. But if I'm wrong, maybe Amanda or Heather can speak a little bit more about the various ways in which FLEdGE and the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems have been connected internationally. Maybe not. Oh, Heather?
I'm just going to point out to Alison that she does have speaking permission, so you can unmute yourself if you're able. So that
okay, there we go. Okay, super. Yeah, thanks for the question and the interest in the international part of the work that we do. We actually have a couple of projects that we're directly involved in over the last few years. One is a city region food systems project with an organization called RUAF that does urban agriculture. That's its area of expertise. And also the UNFAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. And that project is focused on building sustainable regional food systems. And we've done some pilot studies in Colombo in Sri Lanka. We've also done some work in Kitwe and Lusaka in Zambia, and we've got some projects in Quito and Medellin as well. That project is all ended out now. So we're looking at climate resilience and also pandemic reactions and adaptations to other shocks and hazards. And that work is taking place also in Colombo, but in Tamale in Ghana, and also in, Antananarivo in Madagascar. And really what the points of all those projects is to do exactly what everybody in the webinar has been talking about, is building the capacity locally to address all of the different issues that are required to have a sustainable food system, including supply chains or value chains, as Martha said. So I think that there's some great examples, pilot studies online that you can access. If you want, I can send you the link. Unfortunately, I can't do that right now because I don't have the ability to do that. I think that's probably we're also involved in another project called the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which helps cities measure the change out. So that might be, and I think there's over 220 cities involved in that project globally now. So that's a really expansive and extensive project. And all of these projects are meant to be adapted to the local place. So there's a bunch of, as Irena was pointing out, and this is really the work that we do through FLEdGE. So somebody was asking about action-oriented. All we've done is developing research questions with communities, so to answer community needs, and then enabling communities to be able to act and helping them act and supporting them as they act on the results that we identify. So I'll leave it there, and if there's other questions, if they go into the chat box, I can try and answer those at another time.
Thank you so much, Allison. Really appreciate you chiming in on that. Amanda, you just unmuted yourself. I'm wondering if you had something to add.
I did. I just wanted to mention that I have put those links already in the chat box, so you can find them there if you scroll up just a tiny bit.
Thank you. Sandra, you unmuted yourself, so I'm hoping you will be able to speak a bit to the international dimensions.
Yes, interestingly enough, working with the small-scale food processors and really focusing on women's issues. And then at one point, I raised up my head and said, what are the policies around here? So I just, did the old Google search and found out that the only people who are really looking at this from the point of view of the role of the small-scale food processor were international organizations, that nothing much was going on in Western countries about this. So I found that was absolutely fascinating, that in many countries, they figured this out and they're doing something about it. And because we're so used to the big guys running the show, we're just now saying we got to raise our heads up and say, where can we make some difference? And where can we learn from some of these international companies who are making changes that we need to make as well? So I think, yes, we do need to connect all the way across the world, really, because this is an international problem. We all have these problems. We need to understand what's going on everywhere to, make sure that we're looking in the right places and we're doing the right work.
Thank you, Sandra. I think that's one of the things we really learned through our work with FLEdGE, and I'm sure Ferris, I'm not sure if he's still on the call, but he could speak to this given his international work around agroecology, is that we really are, the more we delve into resilient and robust food systems, the more we realize that opposite to the sort of traditional 20th century, here's the global north, with scientific and technological expertise telling the global south how to do things, that those of us who live in the global north are more and more looking at the global south to learn how to do things better. And I think that's a really important point that you're making around, especially women who are in the agri-food sector, and especially women who are working on small scale processing. Would any of our other panelists like to speak to this? No? We are coming really close to, I keep saying 1:30. We're coming very close to 1:30. I realize that not everybody's in the same time zone, so forgive me for that. But we are coming close to the end of our webinar. If you have any follow-up questions, please have a quick look in the chat box before we sign off, because the links to the panelists' profiles are already posted in the chat box. If you haven't had a chance to copy any of those, but you want to get in touch either with the panelists or anybody who helped organize this webinar, please just get in touch with us. Reminder again, one of the easiest ways to connect with this network is to follow FLEdGE on Twitter, which is just @FLEdGE Research. So you can find out more information there. Get in touch with us if you want to know more about the upcoming webinars. And thank you so much for taking the time on a Friday to join us, when I know most people are really tired of video calls and online events. Once again, many thanks to the center and Heather and Amanda and Allison for organizing and running this show. And special thanks to all 4 of our panelists for being so kind and generous to share your insights and ideas with us today. I think that's it for today. Have a great weekend, everyone.